Hello, my name is Mike Carney, and I'm here in Baltimore with Mr. Rod Kirkwood, and it's my pleasure this afternoon to chat with Rod about his tenure as president of the ASHRAE Society during the year 73 to 74. And Rod, we're here in beautiful Baltimore here on the 29th of June 1992, and we're happy to have you here, and thank you for coming, and look forward to what you have to tell us about your years in the ASHRAE chairs.
Good afternoon, Mike.
Rod, when you were president, what was the focus of activities that ASHRAE was engaged in at that time?
Well, in 1972, as you may remember, and early 73, we had long lines at the service stations for people waiting for gas for their cars, and it was an energy shortage that was of significance. I'm inclined to refer to it as more of a distribution shortage, really, than it was an actual shortage. But nevertheless, it was a problem, and it had come to everybody's attention. So it was a area of public concern. Along with this, there were a lot of people talking about how energy should be used, what should be done about it. For example, I think it was the New York Professional Engineers Society that proposed that they shut off all the air conditioning in the buildings in New York in order to reduce the use of energy. And such a thing would have been a disaster if you stop and think about it. The saving in energy would have been peanuts compared to the damage done to the efficiency of the people working and in the buildings in New York that were designed to operate with air conditioning in order to provide for efficiency of the people there and as well their comfort in their living areas also. With solutions of that type that were frightening, actually, for fear that people that didn't understand how energy ought to be used and how to conserve it would set up rules for everybody else to live by. The federal government was into it, there were a lot of people into it, and the vast majority of them were much more into the emotional end of it than the practical end. So it became necessary for ASHRAE to pay attention to this. I started in with a theme for the year was optimization of energy utilization. Not the word conservation, but this would result in conservation without destroying what was being done throughout the country. During the course of the year, I received a note from Press McNall of our society, who brought out the point that the Bureau of Standards had been asked to write a energy code for NICSPICS, which is a building code, national building code group, and on that basis I wrote and volunteered the help of ASHRAE and to the Bureau of Standards in developing whatever they were going to come up with in guiding or advising or reviewing. They came back to me with a suggestion that they were going to have a draft available and would like to have an opportunity to present that to ASHRAE. So I told them that, wrote them as I recall, and asked for a copy of it so that we could have some preview of it before our winter meeting in January of '74, which was down in Los Angeles. They sent a copy ultimately, and I got it in time to take a quick look at it, make copies, and distribute to all of the technical and research committee chairmen so that they would have had at least an opportunity to look at it and perhaps discuss it with some of their committee people. We got to Los Angeles, and by this time there was a groundswell within ASHRAE, which essentially was taking pretty much taking the position that what was this we were trying to foist off on getting ASHRAE to put their stamp on it and turn it loose on the world. And that was not what the purpose was. The meeting that we had set up for reviewing this in Los Angeles grew in fairly large proportions, so we ended up in a major ballroom area in order to have enough room for everybody. And by this time it appeared that since it was maybe not quite a lynch mob, but pretty close to it, that it was necessary to, since I had started this thing, to take the chairing of the meeting over myself, and so I did. Figured that they were less likely to hang the president than they would be somebody else in the society. So on that basis, we had a discussion. What we did was the National Bureau of Standards representatives presented what they had accomplished in attempting to put this thing together. And they were free to admit that they were a long ways from having a finished product, that they were at least concerned about the appropriateness of the product that they were turning out. They got a very large response, but it became instead of an emotional one, it began to develop into an engineering response. And before the meeting was over, there was an understanding that this was not something that anybody was asking for a rubber stamp on or a stamp of approval with or attempt to railroad it through. Instead, it was an effort to accomplish an end result.
Rod, was there an awareness that there was very close scrutiny being paid to the development of this energy standard that you were working on?
The subject of an energy standard was of very great importance to everybody there, no question about it. It wasn't a casual thing. They recognized it as being a matter of extreme national importance and importance of to them as individuals as well as to the society. And they were taking, as ASHRAE members normally do, they were taking then a real engineering positive view of how something could be done before that meeting was over. Following the meeting, I talked with the National Bureau of Standards people. They suggested that as far as they were concerned, they would like to turn the whole subject over to ASHRAE to do, but it was urgent that it get done. However, they were not at liberty to turn it over to us. They could recommend to NICSPICS that they, in turn, turn it over to us. And we came to an agreement that they would attempt to do that. On that basis, we put together our team to accomplish this. We set up committees. We talked about how to do it, how to break it down in order to be able to do it quickly. And I invited the Illuminating Engineering Society in as a participant, since lighting is a major portion of the energy use in buildings. Also invited the American Institute of Architects in to develop the section on the envelope of the building. So we had that pretty well put together in fairly short order as to how we would go about doing it. I had done some advance work on it before we got to Los Angeles meeting. The biggest problem we had was how to fund this. There was no government subsidy. There was no funding. NICSPICS had no money. So that's part of why they had used the National Bureau of Standards, although they were almost a subsidiary of that. But they were funded to the extent that they were by the federal government, and we weren't. There was no process set up to fund this. So the problem of funding became extremely important. We had scheduled a increase in dues, but it was increased to cover the normal impact of inflation, and that was scheduled for the following year. I went to the board of directors with the package essentially of what we needed to do, what we would expect to do, assuming NICSPICS asked us to proceed with this. And the first point that I assured them was that we would not accept the effort on the basis that we would take what the National Bureau of Standards had done and simply continue it. I would accept it on the basis that it would be reference material to us, but it would be an ASHRAE standard done by ASHRAE in ASHRAE's own way. That's the only way we would accept it. If we did, we had the the committee organization organized enough so we were satisfied how it would be set up, but we lacked funds for simply the process of publishing it and for review. And this would be a multi-page standard, obviously, and it would cost us a fair amount of money to publish, so we needed to raise funds. On that basis, we need to move the dues increase up a year, but we need to increase it to roughly 50% of the dues everybody was paying. This was of great concern to many of the board members. There was a lot of discussion, and the biggest concern was that that kind of an increase in dues would result in a significant loss of membership. In the discussion that we had, I went back and forth a whole lot, but the fundamental point that I made was that we had to do it. We didn't have any real choice. There was no alternative. It had to be done. If we didn't do it, somebody else was going to do it, and it was going to be a disaster. Had at least all the opportunities to be a disaster. If ASHRAE did it, it would be done right. We had to do it very quickly. It wasn't something we could debate and review again in June. It needed to be done by June.
Now, this was at the January meeting that you were doing this, and you were to have a government project completed by September?
Yeah, if they give it to you.
Good luck.
Yeah. It was a very ambitious program. But I think that there was a lot of energy from everybody that was there that made up maybe for the national shortage of energy, but at least it was there and it needed to be funneled or channeled. The ultimate result was that the board of directors supported where I was and voted it in. At the luncheon, the president's luncheon, I made the announcement that we were going to take this aboard, and it consisted of several things. One, of course, was that we're going to take it aboard if it was offered to us, as it probably would be. We felt that it was necessary that it be done. But in addition to that, we had to publicize the fact that we were doing such a product or going to provide such a product. In other words, that there was an organization that knew how to use energy and how to use it efficiently, and knew what they were talking about rather than an emotional outburst. Along with that, proposed to establish a energy committee in all chapters and request them to establish a society energy committee and provide a regional representative on the Energy Conservation Committee from each region, and they would be the members of the committee, but their job would be to go back to the region and assist the chapters in developing their program of and the principal basis of that whole program was letting the public know through the public press. It was no longer adequate for us to talk to ourselves as engineers, which is what we had done for generations. It was a communication among ourselves. That's what ASHRAE was. It was an exchange of technical information, a learning process for engineers. It was not aimed at the general public, but this was something where we had to aim it at the general public.
Now, you were going out with this to a much broader public than just the ASHRAE membership, and indeed a broader public than ASHRAE had ever addressed before.
That's exactly right. In order to accomplish this, we need to retain PR counsel, our public relations counsel, and put them to work at it. That was part of what we were also asking for the dues increase for, because that cost us additional money. So with this, I got a good reception at the President's Luncheon from the general membership, as well as those who were there from the board who had an exposure, and a number of those in the general membership had been at the previous meeting meeting the night before, I guess it was, with it was a day before, with the Bureau of Standards people. So it was all compressed, which I think is probably faster than ASHRAE usually works. Anyway, we left Los Angeles with an approval of the direction we were moving by It took from then until I think it was the latter part of March when NICSPICS had their meeting, which was in Salt Lake City. They invited me down and asked ASHRAE to take it over and do it. Of course, in the meantime, we really hadn't been sitting twiddling our thumbs or waiting. We had set up our committees, we got our committee members lined up, and we were ready to go. So as soon as we had it, well, we began work on it. And by this time, we had committees from IES then and from AIA, and we all went to work on it. Everybody paid their own way to the meetings of their committees, and it was entirely a volunteer effort. And they met physically. They met at least, each committee met at least once a month, and that meant bringing people from various parts of the country together at their own on their own time.
These meetings, were they in regions, or was this drawing from folks from a national geography?
But they were national meetings. This was a standards committee, or a group of standards committees, somewhat like the handbook, where you have a committee, an overall committee, and you have a series of subcommittees that have one chapter apiece to do, or something like that. Well, that was about the same kind of a procedure we were using here. And so the committees consisted of, I don't remember how many, but I think 10 or 12 people in each committee. So it was a fairly significant group. And they worked together, and they turned out a product. And our goal was to turn it out by the 1st of June. We were a little bit after the 1st of June, but that came primarily from the fact that the American Institute of Architects advised that they were not happy with the process, and that they felt that this should not be issued as a standard, as an ASHRAE standard. They would support it if it was issued as as ASHRAE principles of practice. I met with the head of their energy committee in Chicago, it was Leo Daly, and we discussed this subject. Essentially what it amounted to was that if we proceeded along the path that they had suggested, they would continue to support us. If we didn't, they felt that they had no alternative but to withdraw. There was no basis in which I could change the direction that we were going, to downgrade what the standard was. It was too important, and the mandate from the society was that it be a standard. I advised them of that, and they indicated that on this basis they were withdrawing. The committee had gone a long ways towards writing the envelope chapter at that time, and we simply set up an additional committee and finished it.
Looking back now, Rod, do you think that the absence of endorsement by the AIA had any effect, either positive or negative, on the acceptance and use of this standard as it was published?
I don't believe so. The standard was accepted when it came out, and of course we went through a consensus procedure after that for reviewing it before it was published in '75. This was mid-'74 at this point in time. But we had it published by the end of my term at the end of January, or end of June. So from March till June, we turned out a major standard for the society, and one that went out was published and issued in several thousand copies for a consensus review throughout the country. And we got back tremendous review, and there was work done on it following. But we had set the basis for it. Standards usually aren't done in a year or 2 years, usually many years.
Well, how many energy standards had we written prior to this?
I don't know we had any.
We didn't have any, did we?
I know of none, anyway.
And you were affecting not only the work that ASHRAE traditionally does, but you were affecting other trades within the building.
Drastically, yeah. We affected the envelope of the entire envelope of the building and what could be done with it and how it had to be done. We affected certainly the lighting in the building. And we affected also out of this what we were demanding of manufacturers and the level of improvement initially, but ongoing from there.
Did we mention the fact that we had the Illumination Society on board and endorsing this?
They stayed with us, and in fact today they're still a co-sponsor of the standard. I think it was a good relationship for them and for us, and I think it has been advantageous for both of us. The envelopes have changed radically because of this standard, and so the architectural industry has been impacted. I don't know that I've ever heard anything very negative out of that, even though they had withdrawn as a co-sponsor.
What do you think the basis of the reluctance on the part of AIA to continue to participate in this was founded upon? Was it that they didn't like the idea of their envelope being dictated to or adjusted in some way by someone other than themselves?
I'm sure that had to be a portion of their concern, but it was really the whole subject of energy conservation, or as I called it, optimizing the utilization of energy, was a subject whose time had come, and there was no way they were going to stop it or anyone else was going to stop it. It was going to happen. Either we had to do something about it, or somebody else would have to fill the vacuum that was there. And it had to go ahead. I believe that the standard we turned out has been extremely successful. It did all the things I said it would do, and more. My basic point during that year, and I went and talked with some of the congressional people and so forth to try to drum up interest in energy conservation. And I was dumbfounded at the lack of interest I received. Their primary emphasis at the congressional level was the development of new sources of energy and expansion of the sources of energy, not in energy conservation. They had very little time or use for it. It was sort of like, I pat you on the head a little bit and tell you to run along, fella. You've had your opportunity to say something, and now we want to take care of things. They didn't know how to take care of it. They were completely and totally off. What has really been effective has been energy, a careful use of energy. And conservation is perhaps a term, but it's not. It doesn't really represent it. Conservation may simply mean curtailing the use. We didn't curtail the use. We put buildings to work so they would still provide the comfort and the rest of the conditions necessary for manufacturing plants, for office buildings, schools, or anything else. And all we did with it was to use energy effectively. I said again, the optimum utilization. That was what was the whole purpose for it. I told them at that time that I think it was 30% of the energy in the country was being used in buildings for heating, air conditioning, water heating, ventilation, industrial plants, as well as other types of buildings and homes. And out of that 30%, we ought to be able, by simply using what we knew at that time, we should be able to save 50% of that, or 15% of the total energy the country was using. That was more than the shortfall that we had. It would have solved the entire problem. Now, that meant that you had to go back and retrofit existing buildings as well as build new ones. After all, simply building new buildings that used less energy per square foot didn't solve your problem at all, because they were still new buildings, and there was still new energy they were using. So it was only one leg of the three-legged stool, or whatever you call it, that was being accomplished. But it was the first leg, and it was the most important one at that point in time to get it started. So we came out with a standard and that standard was processed with what turned out to be the basis for a consensus standard. There was no basis for it up till that time. We developed that as well, and that worked effectively. We had reviewers by the thousands, and those reviews came in, and each committee reviewed all the reviews that came in and responded to each one.
Let me dwell on that for just a second, because I was one of those young people out in the hills and bushes that wrote a response to that first standard. Wasn't the order of magnitude of the responses and input that you had for that totally different than anything you had before?
Yes. The usual process in the past was to get input from known experts in the field, and that was about the extent of it. This was different. This was, we were all experts in using energy because that's what our business is, and still is. That's what the people within ASHRAE do, is they utilize energy for comfort, for food preservation, for a whole lot of things, but they're using energy. They're putting to use for the well-being of the general public. And so they were all experts in this, and we needed an input from all of them. So we made it as broadly available as possible. We did charge for copies of it for those people that we didn't have some particular reason to be aware of their needs. But we distributed it widely, and there were many thousand. That's why we had to raise money in order to publish it. And so it was I think it was an effective process, and it evolved. This wasn't all set up in advance as to exactly how this would work, but it evolved as we went along. By this time, my year was over when that part was going on, but I still remained active in the process of this. And I had asked for as well a standard to be started for energy utilization in existing buildings, and that's the 100 series. And the 100 series got started, but it was a long time evolving from there.
Now we're on the second edition of that standard now, aren't we?
Yeah.
And it has grown
Yeah.
in its coverage.
And it's more complex as well.
Yes, it is.
But we did have in the basic one, we had the process of both a prescriptive standard and an alternative in which you could use an energy calculation in lieu of a prescriptive envelope, for example, a prescriptive system. So it was a combination which allowed flexibility and yet provided a basis that was understandable. It took, going on from there into the future, it took a program by ASHRAE to help educate the public, or not the public, but at least the energy design public, in how to use it, how to apply it, how to understand it. But it was, for somebody who wanted to sit down and take the time to understand it, it was usable from the first.
Now, Rod, let's depart from your discussion of the energy standard for a little bit and talk about Rod Kirkwood and your walk and experiences in the ASHRAE committees and in the chairs.
Well, I had been working as back at the start of World War II, there was a draft and a fishbowl with numbers in it and so forth. And I was working as a blueprint boy for an industry that was then the new concept of the defense industry during the summer while I was in college. And my number came up as number 2 out of the fishbowl. So if I left the company I was with to go back to college, well, I went directly into the service. If I stayed with them, I got a deferment because it was a defense industry. So I stayed, and I became a draftsman, ultimately a designer. And I only had a couple of years of school at that time, but it was enough for a background in it. So I ended up in the mechanical department in a defense contractor that was building the Navy bases.
When your draft number is number 2, That's an inspiration to study harder, isn't it?
Study.
Yeah, it did. Anyway, so I was interested at this time in heating, ventilating, air conditioning as a result of that. Ultimately, this industry was replaced by the Seabees, so I did go into service, and I spent some 3 years in the service. When I came out, I had, or as I was getting towards the time of coming out, I'd gone through officer candidate school and a few other things. I had an opportunity to be stationed near New York City, and so I went up to a meeting of ASHRAE in New York City from down there. I guess that helped continue the interest. I went back to, when I got out of service, I went back to Seattle, and I took a job with one of the other design-build firms that were doing both design and building. That was Austin Company. Worked for them for a while and moved on from there. But and I went back to school part-time and such. But I then was in Seattle, where I could join a chapter, and I did. And at that time it was called the Pacific Northwest chapter, I guess it was. It was sort of a broad sweep of country that it covered, but there weren't many chapters. I found it a useful source of learning, and I continued to be a chapter member. Became the treasurer of the chapter, and learned that one of the duties of the chapter treasurer was to make up whatever deficit there was for the year.
Oh, is that right? That's another inspiration to be active.
It was a good inspiration. I got busy and saw to it that we issued bills to everybody, and it was surprising how many people paid that had not paid for years, and so we ended up with a profit, or I should say a surplus. So I suggested on that basis that since if I had had a deficit, I would have had to make it up. I ought to be able to take the surplus with me, but nobody agreed that.
Nobody agreed to that part.
No.
Somehow they wouldn't.
Yeah. But anyway, it was a few years later, I ended up on the chapter board of officers. I had been treasurer, and then I wasn't anything for a few years, and then I came back into being I guess a vice president. I got elected to that, and so it turned out that I was the president. I'd just been installed as president when we had a regional meeting in Seattle, and it was a important regional meeting as far as I was concerned. It was the first one I had ever had any real exposure to. So, and in our chapter, the president was a representative at the regional meeting besides, so I got a whole lot of exposure in a hurry. Tom White had been the regional chairman of the relatively new organization of ASHRAE, and was ASHVE, ASHAE, merged with ASRE and become ASHRAE, and so the process was evolving. Tom White of San Francisco was the regional chairman for Region 10, and instead of putting in 1 3-year term, he put in, I guess, 4 or 5 years at least before somebody got around to finding a way to relieve him. And so the regional meeting was to make a recommendation to the society over who they ought to consider for the regional chairman. And out of this process, I got recommended, and ultimately got elected to the board, with only having been, I think, to 1 or 2. I think really I had never been to any other national meeting except the one that I had gone to originally in New York City.
My goodness.
So I was suddenly part of a bigger organization, and a more complex one than I really had expected. But Tom was very helpful in getting me started as regional chairman. Region 10, which is what it was called in those days, ran all the way from Tucson on the south to Vancouver, BC on the north. And this was a lot of miles to travel, and to make all of those chapters once a year was quite a feat in itself.
Well, now, did you get reimbursed for some of this travel?
We got paid for the airfare. We didn't get paid for any of the other expenses.
Okay.
So those were mine to take care of. I talked the company into contributing most of those.
And who were you working for at this time when you were regional director or regional chairman?
John Graham and Company at that time. But subsequently, I became the president of it and the partner in the associated company and so forth. But that was later. I had a lot of fun in Region Central. And the board of directors, there were several of us that sort of learned fairly early on that Region Central ran the society. The people that were running it just didn't understand that to begin with. But we changed their mind on that. You know, we had at that time 21 members of the board of directors. There were 10 regions, and the chairman of the Region Central, who was the first vice president, I think, at that time, later became president-elect. But anyway, with the 11 of us that were in that meeting, we had a majority of the board of directors. So all we had to do was to get a unanimous support in Region Central, and we went to board of directors, and we got what we wanted. And we did it, time and again. And it changed the direction of the society. We changed it that the nominating committee members were elected from the regions, rather than being appointed. We changed many things. One of them was starting the process of an assistant to the regional chairman, and instead of calling him an assistant, we made him a regional
vice chairman?
No, it wasn't a vice chairman. We made him a regional membership committeeman, as I recall. And then we went on to add to that research fundraising. And when I was president, I added the energy conservation member and so on. So we developed a structure that went out into the grassroots.
Mm-hmm. That was a subtle thing you did, making the nominating committee come from the CRC rather than be appointed by the board, but that's been a very effective thing for ASHRAE. It's a very important part
that
of
was
ASHRAE.
Done very deliberately. You know,
Yeah.
Prior to that time, we had to a fair extent a clique that pretty much was self-supporting.
Good old boy network.
Yeah, it was a network of that kind, and I don't know that it was negative, but it was what existed. Yeah. And it had evolved over the years. But to broaden it, to make it strong, the only thing that makes ASHRAE strong is its broad membership. Mm-hmm. And we broadened it. And we set out to do that. There was Jack Thompson and Stan Gilman and myself and a couple of others that set out with this as after we got to know each other, this is a determined policy, and we did it, and it worked. We did a lot of things like that, and we took the ASHRAE and ARI shows were in alternate years, and they were in competition with each other, and they were independent shows, and we took those, we had a problem, we had a couple of problems. But one year the ARI show was going to be in late fall, and the ASHRAE show was going to be in January. They were in separate years, but they were only a couple of months apart. And that wasn't very satisfactory to anybody, but that was an example of the kind of thing that happened. So Stan Gilman and I were picked as a committee, and we went down and talked to ARI about it. And we convinced them that it was much better if we merged the show together, and with that merger that we worked out an arrangement with them that they would still get a portion of the returns, but we would get the lion's share. And it's gone that way ever since, and it's worked well, and we've never had the problem anymore. They were having a light attendance at their show because they didn't have an ASHRAE meeting along with it, and the combination made it a much better show. And we also had the agreement that every other year would be at that time either either Chicago or excuse me.
Chicago.
Every fourth year would be Chicago, and every halfway between that would be a cycle with New York. Well, New York didn't work out well because the Coliseum in New York was only available if you signed up for every year, so we had to work out something different than that, which we did. But the big show was every second year. The show in between was one that was somewhat smaller, and we could move it around the country and bring it out to people throughout much of the rest of the country. Because at that time there wasn't a facility in many places that was big enough for the big show. But we did this still as an ASHRAE ARI show. It worked well. It brought something out to the whole country that wouldn't have been there otherwise. And yet, of course, we had the summer meeting where we didn't have a show, so that could go into places that didn't have to have an exhibition hall at all. Well, it was a planned process. It didn't happen. It was deliberately planned, and we worked it, and it worked well.
Well, I think ASHRAE has done a very, very good job of getting these meetings out to the people in the chapters, and in fact, I look forward to become international in scope, and I bet we're going to see some water under these airplanes bringing people to this meeting.
I think that's true.
Let's talk about people now for a moment. Do you have any stories about the people that you'd like to share with us now?
Well, I think there's sort of a broad people story. There's innumerable individuals that could be talked about, but I think that there's a broad people story, and that is that I've never found anybody in ASHRAE that wasn't a willing worker. All you have to do is touch the right button and they'll bust their behind for you. They really are. Just like the crew that went to work, there are hundreds of people that went to work on Standard 90. As I said before, at their own expense, which meant that they were really paying to take aboard extra effort. And they worked extremely hard. The kind of thing we did would have, if you tried to pay somebody, some organization to provide the caliber of people that we had working on it and pay them to write that standard, I don't think they could have done it in the length of time we had available as a paid effort for a consulting firm of some type. These people really did yeoman's work, and they did it with hard work. But they built in enthusiasm and belief in the whole thing that was, it's hard even thinking backwards to it to realize how you could get that kind of a crew working under those circumstances.
That's another good example of a situation within ASHRAE that shouldn't work, but so many people took it upon themselves to contribute to the formulation of these standards. That energy standard has been really a contribution to the whole building industry and the national energy optimization effort.
It's more than that. It's an international activity, regardless of the fact that it's an ASHRAE standard. It still certainly is a full international basis for energy conservation throughout the world. It has been a very effective thing. But it was that kind of a thing that said what I did. Never found anybody that wasn't a willing worker. Some of them were working at perhaps somewhat different, with a different agenda than others, but you just had to hit the right button, and there's fit into everything else, and there's a certain amount of questions that have to be asked that somebody might not otherwise. And so they were all contributing, and contributing effectively. Jack Tumulty was the chairman of this thing, and he put in untold hours of effort, and there were many others just like that, just an unlimited effort.
And all those contributions are relatively small ones. They're not big contributors, any one of them. It is totally unlike any other fundraising activity. It's a whole bunch of small contributors, and I think you're very, very right. It has a very beneficial effect on each chapter and the community that each chapter lives in. Rod, if you were going to give advice to a young man who had the number 2 number in the draft and was working on a drawing board in an engineering firm, what kind of thing would you say to him?
Well, I guess what worked out for me was perhaps accidental, but it worked out well. I would think that so long as he can continue to learn where he's at and contribute towards what's going on in the defense effort, he had a positive part of it. If we had to have him in the military, well, when his time came, why, he would have to go, that's all. You come back from it and pick up where you left off.
I meant more, what advice would you give to people about how they would relate to ASHRAE and maybe get started within ASHRAE?
I think that's an important aspect. We can be wrapped up in our own social activities, our family activities, our basis in which we're earning our income, and all that's necessary. But in order to broaden beyond that, you need to understand your industry and contribute to the industry. You're taking out of the industry, you need to put something back to help the industry grow, to improve it for yourself, but to improve it for the generations to come as well. And I think that's what ASHRAE can do for you. I think there's a high level of satisfaction out of it. The pay isn't very good, but the satisfaction is terrific.
But the volunteer opportunities are enormous.
Yeah, there's lots of those.
All right, as we draw to a close, are there any other observations or comments that you would like to make?
Well, I guess the biggest concern would be we not become complacent, that we've got a lot of things yet to do, and they will keep on happening out there waiting for somebody to grasp the opportunity and do something with them. Either you rise to those and take care of them, or somebody else will step in and do it, and you will have lost the opportunity. Maybe you don't have to put the effort forth then if somebody else is doing it, but you've lost the opportunity, and you've lost the opportunity of seeing that it got done right. And I think from that standpoint that we need to be moving ahead just as intensely today as we were back in the days of putting out ASHRAE Standard 90. Those are things that we can do. The base we have to work from is much broader. Our financial position is a whole lot different than it was then. The total annual budget at the time I was president, including the research, was about $2 million, and I think we're up to many times that now.
Yes, it's on the order of 13 to 14 million now.
Well, see, that's 7 times, and that's we're now talking 20 years ago, so that's pretty good growth in 20 years. Just like the growth of our society, we're still growing. And we're growing in spite of the current, or what has just been a recession. And most societies are not only not growing, they're shrinking. So we've got something going, but we could very easily get that reversed on us if we don't keep a high level of interest and a high level of doing what the membership needs.
What kind of things would you hope to see ASHRAE focus on or improve in the coming years?
Well, I think that the subject of energy is still what our basic effort is utilizing energy. I think that still needs lots of attention for not only for the effective utilization of it, but in conserving our resources, but also in minimizing the impact on the environment. Every BTU that we convert into energy that ends up being in the atmosphere somewhere is an impact on the environment. And from that standpoint, we need to utilize energy the most efficient way possible, and that reduces our need for energy, but it also reduces the pollution aspect of it. I think that's really our principal. We shouldn't lose sight of the fact that that's really the basis for our whole industry.
Is there anything you'd like to say now as we close, or final comment?
I think ASHRAE is a unique organization. It has it's special, partially because it involves the design profession, but it also involves all of the other related activities, whether it's design, it's manufacturers, it's contractors, it's sales representatives. It's the whole industry. It isn't an isolated ivory tower design organization. And I think that's what makes it very special, and it's good. It has a lot more vitality and a lot more life than it would have otherwise. And that's very important to the members. I think it's also important to its future, and I think it has a great future.
Well, Rod, I thank you for joining us this afternoon and being part of these Leadership Recalled interviews, and enjoy your stay here in Baltimore, and we have certainly enjoyed this opportunity to talk to you.
Thank you.